Hello and welcome to State of the Economy. Today we have with us a very special guest, Mr. Sher Verick, who works at as a senior economist at the ILO office for South Asia, but based in Delhi. He's also worked as a senior economist in the Employment Research Unit at Geneva, the ILO headquarters. Welcome to our show, Mr. Sher Verick.
Thank you.
The reason why we decided to speak to you this week is to really understand what is going on with the employment in the world, employment rate in the developed world as also the developing world. And something unprecedented seems to be happening because unemployment rate is stuck, very rigidly stuck at where it was after the global crisis. Maybe it's come down a little bit, and median wages are down to I'm told 1998 levels in the US, and I'm sure it has implications for the emerging economy. So just give us a sense of what's going on with global employment or unemployment as captured in your 2014 report on employment.
Okay, well, thank you. You're asking about some critical fundamental issues that, of course, the ILO has been very vocal on in recent years in terms of the urgency of these employment issues. And as you've referred to, the global financial crisis in particular was a rude awakening, really, in terms of where we were economically, but also from a labor market perspective. Even though, ILO had been saying there was a jobs crisis even before the crisis. We have been very clear on that for some years, that, despite...
So you're saying that there was a job crisis building up before that too? Okay.
Well, indeed, the whole, if you look at the pre-crisis period, this was a period of unprecedented growth, both in developed and developing countries. It was one of the first times when the world was growing as one.
You mean the period 2002 to 2008?
Exactly. This is a golden period from an economic growth perspective. Yeah. India, of course, was doing very well, growing up to 10%. China, all the emerging economies, but also the advanced economies were growing at rates that I haven't seen for many decades. But of course, the whole issue, what was happening in the labour market? Clearly, unemployment had fallen, but there were inherent vulnerabilities in the labour market that were there that the global financial crisis exposed.
Okay. You mean the structural distortions were there, which got exposed after the financial crisis?
There were distortions. Partly you can say distortions, but also the nature of the types of jobs that were being created. A lot of temporary work had been created, of course. You see in advanced economies that were hit hard by the global financial crisis. Sure. Spain, Ireland, US, of course. A lot of people were in construction, the construction sector. This was linked, of course, to the housing bubbles and the real estate investment that had gone on. Yeah. And these were the first people to lose jobs. Then, of course, others were losing jobs in the manufacturing sector. So the global financial crisis, came as an awakening in the sense, these jobs, these gains that had been made during that period were quickly reversed.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting you mentioned housing. Yeah. Because, I was in Spain some 6 months ago, and I was told by economists there that Spain had built 3 houses where one was needed. Right. So there was such an overcapacity. Yes. And suddenly the housing bubble there is probably more severe than or as severe as in the US. Right. And again, the bulk of those who have gone unemployed, exactly, become unemployed are in the housing sector. Right. So does this mean that unless housing is revived in many of these economies, the unemployment level will not fall to the earlier levels? Well,
there is a very important issue about where the jobs will come from. Because if you look at, where the jobs have been created, they were in such sectors as construction. But, of course, other sectors have suffered, manufacturing being one in many countries. But the nature of growth is critical in terms of how sustainable those jobs are. Construction, yes, is an important employer. It's an important contributor to growth. But ultimately, it cannot be the main driver. It's an unsustainable driver, as we're reminded every time there is a housing bubble. So, really, I think that was the fundamental problem for many economies, that the nature of the growth...
So you're saying that probably they were depending too much on the construction sector?
Exactly. The nature of the growth wasn't so sustainable. If you're going to rely on the construction sector to drive your economic growth and employment, then clearly you're going to face this type of crisis. Even global financial crisis or no global financial crisis, housing markets go through this type of cyclical changes, right? So, these are some of the sort of wake-up calls that we saw, of course, a massive increase in unemployment, particularly in advanced economies as a result of the global financial crisis. Spain, you mentioned unemployment rates for young people now are over 50%, around 50%.
Yeah. I think 55%.
Right now, yes, so it's an increase, yeah.
Sure, you spoke about youth unemployment. 55% youth unemployment in Spain. And in many other European economies, 20-30% youth unemployment. That is unemployment among youth in the age group of 15 to 24, right?
That's correct.
Now, please explain to us, what is this phenomenon? I mean, has this ever happened before?
Well, yes. I mean, one of the clear findings of the global financial crisis was that youth were hit the hardest. Youth were hit the hardest during the crisis in many European countries, but also around the world. They were the ones who lost their jobs first, of course, and they were also in these sectors in vulnerable types of employment, temporary employment, etc. Okay. So, this resulted in, very rapid increases of unemployment rates in a number of countries. You mentioned Spain, Greece, we have around 50% as well. Portugal is also very high. And these sort of levels have been witnessed for many decades, I guess at least, since the Second World War. So this has become a major, priority and challenge for these economies.
So you're saying such youth unemployment levels have not been seen since the World War, right?
Well, in general terms, I can't say for any specific country, but in general terms, we're seeing, levels that haven't been witnessed for many decades. And, these are real challenges for those countries that have been hit hard.
Is ILO studying this?
Yes, indeed. We've done a lot of work. You referred to our Global Trends Report 2014, which has, of course, a lot of focus also on youth and mentions, the overall figure of 75 million youth unemployed around the world, around 13% youth unemployment rate, but also talks about specific policy areas. I mean, that, is an important sort of area that ILO is focused on in recent years and what governments should be doing.
And these are educated youth, but they're not employable or of a want of more manufacturing activity or?
Yeah, that's a good question. And in many countries, it's often the less skilled youth that are suffering more. So the ones who are dropping out of school early, they don't have college education. They're the ones who were taking advantage of those jobs created in the construction sector, etc., that were paying okay for them and they were able to get by, but they're the first ones who lost their jobs. Because if you look at college-educated youth, they're doing far better. So education remains a critical issue in these countries in terms of your vulnerability in the labor market.
Yeah, and I'm told even the U.S., the quality of employment, though unemployment rate has come down to about 7.5%.
Yes, I understand.
But the quality of employment is still not very good, because especially those working in retail outlets,
right.
Their employment is of temporary nature, and they get laid off at the drop of a hat, and then they're not able to pay their health insurance, which is it runs into like $1,500 a month or something. So is that a big challenge?
Yes, it is indeed, and I think it's another issue that ILO has focused on and highlighted in recent years. I mean, one is to look at these changes in employment and unemployment. That's only part of the story.
Part of the story, yeah.
A big part of the story is in terms of job quality. Of course, ILO talks about decent work, and there within that, a critical element is the type of working conditions they have, the type of protection they have, and also very fundamentally what type of wages they're receiving. And there are major challenges in a number of countries, particularly for unskilled, in terms of stagnant real wages or even falling real wages in the case of unskilled workers in countries like the US, which has been remains a big challenge in these countries which are coming out of crisis in terms of the nature of the types of jobs.
Okay, we'll discuss the nature of employment and wages, but after a small break. Please don't go and stay with us. Welcome back to State of the Economy. Mr. Sher, you talked about wages. Now, economists like Joe Stiglitz have said that median wages in the U.S. today are what they were in probably 1998. They've gone back, So what's going on? Why are median wages so low as to have gone back to 1998 levels?
Yeah. Well, this is, a critical issue. Stiglitz and others have highlighted this. At ILO, we've also done this through our global wage report in terms of what has been happening on the wage front. And, the real issue there is what has been happening for not just the median wage, but particularly the wages of the unskilled, the lower end of the distribution of wages. And this is where the main challenge is. They're the ones who have been experiencing stagnating or declining real wages. Stiglitz is referring to basically stagnation in a real wage. So after adjusting for inflation, people are earning pretty much the same level as they were earning, in 1998. There's even talk of the lowest skilled workers, receiving even, wages going back further than the 90s. Yeah. And this is a complex issue, but it's linked to a range of factors and processes that have been happening in recent decades. So it's something that we've highlighted as a critical element that needs to be looked at by governments and policymakers when they're looking at the supporting workers. Of course, wages has a direct impact on poverty, income of the household, but also for demand. This is one of the critical issues that have been highlighted during the crisis. The demand side, and being able to support consumption requires those wages. And if real wages are not increasing, then you can't expect consumption to grow strong.
It's a clear indication that the future demand is not coming, is not going to increase as needed, as desired, right?
Right, exactly.
Now coming back to India, the developing world is facing a different kind of problem, right?
Sure.
Now, I don't think anybody anticipated that that the developed world would face such high unemployment, because the assumption was that they would be closer to full employment. In a down cycle, they'll be down a little, but they'll come back to full employment. But anyway, that's not happening. Yeah. What are the challenges in South Asia which you currently look after now? How do you see the Indian labor market evolving? Because one of the puzzles that we all talk about here, is that nearly 50% of our employment or our employed people are self-employed.
Right.
Now, have you seen such high level of self-employment in a rapidly industrializing or in an industrialized economy?
Yeah, well, you've raised some very important points. I think just as a first sort of response, comment is that indeed, I think what is critical to say is that though this has been the situation in advanced economies with the increase in unemployment and the slow return to sort of full employment, developing countries, emerging economies, and countries in this region face some very different sets of challenges, and they are really all linked to the nature of the employment, job quality, and that results from the dominance of agriculture, and the informal sector. You mentioned self-employment as another way of looking at it in terms of the employment status. And it's, India is quite unique in the sense that as a fast-growing, until recently, a fast-growing lower middle income country, it has a large share of workers in self-employment. The share of workers in regular work is still below 20%.
Okay. Yeah.
So you find India very different from other emerging economies in this respect?
Yes, I mean, if you compare to, let's say, the key middle-income countries, which
give us a comparison.
Yeah, for example, you want to look at other countries like Brazil, South Africa, Turkey, Indonesia. They have a higher share of a lower share of self-employment. Okay, more workers outside of agriculture than India. Indonesia is closer to India. Indonesia would be a better comparison, but.
How much is Indonesia? Roughly, I mean...
well, yeah, I don't have the exact figures for that, but, when you look at India...
closer to India.
Yeah, it's closer to India in terms of those characteristics. And it's true that, I think the word you used was the right one in the sense that the Indian labour market does pose a number of puzzles. I mean, I think that's... And there is no...
Have you ever thought of doing a study of the Indian labour market, and especially a study of the self-employed? What is the nature of self-employment in India?
Yeah, sure. I mean, well, we have done work on these issues over the years in different respects. I mean, I think, you can look at self-employment, and I think particularly, this includes agriculture. I mean, self-employment, really the farmers, etc. That's a big majority. And then there are, of course, the self-employment in terms of the informal sector, urban areas.
Also in services, small services,
yeah. Exactly.
The service sector, the small services, the informal or unorganized sector, as it's called here, in urban areas. But, there are a whole range of puzzles that revolve around that. You have this whole issue of jobless growth, which is often referred to. You've got this issue of, declining participation of women in the labour force during this period of, recent years. Issue of, manufacturing. So they're all connected to the overall challenge of structural change in the labour market. These are all reflections of structural change in the labour market.
Labour market, yeah. And do you see India not having fully absorbed or fully sort of the manufacturing sector not having evolved enough to absorb more labor in the organized sector, into the organized sector?
Well, this is, I think, one of the most important issues that are there before policymakers and on the table for discussion, and has received considerable attention in recent years. What role can the manufacturing sector play, and what role should the manufacturing sector play in India, and not only in India, in South Asia in general, in terms of absorbing, new entrants in the labour force? Because I think, as you know very well, and our experience of development, starting the Industrial Revolution, but also going to the rapidly developing countries of East Asia, Southeast Asia, has been one where the manufacturing sector played a critical role in that transformation. It has been one of the pillars of development, along with the urbanization process. And they're going hand in hand. People moving from rural areas to urban areas and working.
So this is the experience of the developed economies through the early 20th century.
Yes, but even later. Yeah. If you take, Korea, Taiwan, of course, and also, Malaysia.
Until the 70s, 80s.
Exactly. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So this now, I think, is one of the toughest questions facing countries like India and other countries in South Asia, also beyond Africa and other regions of the world, to understand, what role should the manufacturing sector take, and how can it be supported to take on more workers, but absorb more workers in the coming years as they join the labour market.
So do you feel that India's manufacturing as a share of its GDP is still very low, and it should be much higher than it is today?
Right. Well, that
currently it's at about 17% or something.
Well, it's a bit low. I think it's around 16.
16, yeah. And the government wants it to
reach 25.
Take it to 25. Yeah.
That's right. The National Manufacturing Policy, which was adopted at the end of 2011.
So do you see that as one of the key critical reasons why India's labour? There's so many people in the self-employed sector.
Looking at the manufacturing sector, I mean, there are a number of issues. I mean, firstly, it's the scale and the size of that manufacturing sector and how it contributes to the economy as a whole. And indeed, there is opportunity for the manufacturing sector to grow, and that's, of course, the objective of the policy in terms of its contribution to the economy. And in other countries, of course, the manufacturing sector has taken a larger role, but it's not just the share of in output that's going to be the critical factor. It's the nature of the manufacturing.
Nature of the manufacturing. This is very important. We'll come to this point, but after a small break. Okay. Please stay with us. Welcome back to State of the Economy. We are talking to Mr. Sher Verick, a senior economist at the ILO office in Delhi for South Asia. Mr. Verick, you said something very critical. The nature of manufacturing is very important. Now, experience tells us that a steel plant, a 5 million ton steel plant, 30 years ago would have absorbed maybe 30, 40,000 people. Today, you can do a 5 million ton steel plant with maybe 5,000 workers, or a power plant, automated power plant can run with maybe 500 people. So technology is increasing productivity but creating jobless growth. Now, is this a serious challenge? You may increase your manufacturing share of GDP, but you may not improve your nature of your employment.
Well, indeed, you touched on a very fundamental issue there, technology. Technology has changed, of course, drastically in recent decades, and a major issue for developing countries is that technology is often determined and driven externally. In advanced economies where wage costs have gone up considerably, so that technology aims to be labor displacing, right? Sure. So, and this is where it's important to put India in the context. India is also not the country with the lowest wages, and it's not going to compete on wages, and that's also a good thing in the sense India needs to compete in terms of its productivity, competitiveness, and those segments where India can then compete on a global stage. It's not going to compete in the most labor-intensive, low-wage segments in garments. So, in general, of course, there will be parts of India where that may be more feasible, but the issue then becomes, and if certain sectors are going to expand, let's say, automobile sector, of course, is one that until recently was doing better. There are consumer electronics sector, etc. There are, pharmaceuticals, other segments. They will be less labor-intensive than the garment sector, and this will be driven a lot by technology. That doesn't mean they won't create jobs. They will create jobs, but they will also create jobs which require more skills. So the skills part becomes critical. They also have, spillover effects, which are also important to take into account. So that will mean, even if a sector, even if a steel plant is expanding, they will have also effects in the economy, which will create jobs indirectly, etc.
So the ripple effect, yeah.
Yeah, there's sort of ripple effect. But it's true that it's important to take that into account when thinking about how manufacturing can expand, and it will not just be simply creating large-scale factories, etc., that will create jobs for hundreds of thousands like you have in China with the Foxconn factory, which has 150,000 workers. That has never been a reality. In India, it's not likely to be. So really, then the critical part becomes what is going to happen to the small and medium enterprises and also the informal sector, or the unorganized sector. How is that going to benefit from any industrial development, any manufacturing? You can have key firms growing, but then they need
what happens to the smaller firms? Yeah.
They need to be able to benefit from that through value chains, etc.
And one of the narratives in India is that we have not given enough attention to labor-intensive manufacturing at this small scale level.
Right.
Now, do you think India still has the labor arbitrage to fully exploit its labor-intensive manufacturing, like China did in the 90s and 2000s? Yeah.
Well, it's a tough question to say, yes or no in a simple term. But I think,
like in the sense that I'll explain to you the way Chinese are flooding the world markets with labor-intensive stuff like Christmas gifts, pencils, rubbers. You think India has missed that bus?
Yeah, I think partly, on average, you could say India's past that point in terms of competing purely on wages. I mentioned it before. I mean, India's ability, the Indian manufacturing sector to compete will not be based alone on low wages, right? Of course, with the weaker rupee these days, some competitiveness has come in terms of the costs. But costs of doing business in India, in terms of, it's not the wage issue, but there's land, input,
a whole lot of other issues.
A whole lot of other issues that make, costs for manufacturing rather high. So, it's unlikely that you'll see in India a large expansion of these really, labor-intensive, types of manufacturing that China has perfected. But China, of course, is also graduating out of that. Is graduating out of that lower end of manufacturing. Countries that are benefiting are Bangladesh, Vietnam, etc.
Yeah, but not necessarily India.
Well, there are some cases, yes, where and there is a garment sector in India, and there are, so there are some factories and some, enterprises that can take advantage of that. But as a future trajectory, this will be part of the story. But there's always, India, as you know better than I, is one of differences and heterogeneity. That will be part of the story. But the other part of the story will be the developing more value-added manufacturers and being competitive in that end as well.
So then, as an economist, the senior economist at the ILO, how do you see the labor market in South Asia evolving, say, in the next 10 years? Where do you think is India going, or India, Pakistan? They have some similarities, right? So what sort of labor market do you, the quality of employment do you foresee in the next decade?
Yeah, well, it's a very good question, and also to think about what's going to happen, because,
and especially in the context of this nearly 50% self-employed in India,
right,
where the quality of employment is very low. In a little shop, there are 3 family members sitting, whereas only one could do the job. So the other two are essentially just whiling away the time.
Sure.
And I mean, you see changes happening already, so it's important to take stock of what those changes are. If we want to look forward into the future and make projections about what will happen, it's important to reflect, where have the changes occurred? If you look in India, there have been improvements in urban areas, right? So the share of workers in regular wage and salary jobs has increased. Yeah. And that's increased.
Especially in the IT sector.
Yeah, the IT, other services area. That is, creating more and more regular jobs, which have, they may or may not have access to social security employment benefits. That's another issue we can touch on. But in that type of, in terms of the nature of those jobs, that is happening in urban areas. Rural areas, that's happening less. Of course, people are migrating to urban areas. But, you see a lot of changes in urban areas and some positive trends on the type of employment. You see that nature, which is important. But when you want to look in the future.
But even in agriculture, the number of people engaged in agriculture is coming down.
Exactly.
And the average age of farmers, for instance, some states like Andhra Pradesh, I'm told is 45 to 50.
Right.
So younger people are not in farming
exactly.
so much.
I think what important to add and beyond just the nature of those type of employment is those sectors. And what is really the biggest issue to look at is that, yes, agriculture in all countries in this region is falling as a share in employment, right? And in India, it's now happening quite rapidly. It's now the latest data from
2006 onwards. I think 20 million people have left agriculture, 30 million or something.
Even more than that. I mean, now you have in 2011-12, the share is under 50%, around 49% of workers are now in agriculture. The first time below 50%. And in absolute terms, the numbers have come down. But what is interesting, that is also being driven by women withdrawing from agriculture, according to that NSS data. And so when one thinks about the future, the real crux is people are moving out of agriculture. This is what we expect as a country develops. But the question is, where are they going to move to? Okay? And that is, where there's more uncertainty.
That's the big challenge for India.
Yeah. Because if you look in the past, where did most of the unskilled workers end up? Construction.
Sure.
So, wasn't that they were not moving into migration. It's not their generation that will be moving into manufacturing jobs. It's not that generation that can do that. They're unskilled in agriculture. They're going to be unskilled in construction work.
So you're essentially saying that the challenge is to see that this shift from agriculture to industry is is better spread across different sectors, which is a lesson we could learn from what is happening in the developed world, right?
Well, in terms of the development process, I mean, it's that move from agriculture. It's not just industry, of course, the service sector. We can't forget, I mean, the service sector is a dominant sector in this country in terms of employment and the economy. That will not change. So it's that movement. But what is also behind all of that and what will drive that is education.
Thank you for talking to us, Mr. Sher Verick. That's all we have in this edition of State of the Economy. We'll be back with you next week. Thanks for watching.